We have been discussing about Middle Greek philosophers, and we continue our discussions today with yet another Middle Greek philosopher, Plato. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Plato. They say that the trilogy of Socrates, Plato and Aristotle is what sets the tone or the theme or the temperament of the entire Western philosophy, be it Parmenides, who owes his inspiration to Plato, or a lot of other Western philosophers like René Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, who owes their inspiration again to Plato. We need to really start today as to who Plato was, why is he so important, and what are his significant contributions to the world of philosophy. Now, Plato is a philosopher who belonged to the timeline of about 427 to 347 BCE, and he is basically an ancient Greek philosopher. Also, he has been a student of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle. Plato is credited to have founded the academy in Athens, often considered the first university in the Western world. Plato wrote extensively in the form of dialogues, where philosophical issues were explored through conversations, often with Socrates as the central character. Now, this is important to show or to connect that just like in the Eastern or the Oriental dichotomy, we do have the Guru-Sishya Parampara. We also see that kind of a lineage in Socrates and Plato. Plato, who had been an ardent student of Socrates, to show his gratitude, he made sure that whatever dialogues he writes, Socrates, his teacher, is the central character. His works cover ethics, politics, metaphysics, epistemology, aesthetics, and education. Now, why is Plato significant? Firstly, his philosophy, which is called as the theory of forms or theory of ideas. Plato argued that the physical world is imperfect and transient, but beyond it exists a higher eternal reality of forms, example, beauty, justice, truth. Plato also talks about the concept of philosopher king. In the Republic, he proposed that rulers should be wise philosophers who seek truth and justice. About epistemology, Plato distinguishes between opinion, doxa, and knowledge, episteme, emphasizing reason over sensory perception. His influence, we can see that his ideas shaped Western philosophy, Christian thought, and modern political theory. His legacy through his established school, which is considered the first university in the Western world, the Academy, he set a foundation for systematic study of philosophy and science. Now, at this juncture, it is important to start on with what are the core distinctions between Socrates, his teacher, and Plato. If we look at the PPT here, we see that the life of Socrates is 469 to 399 BCE, where he lived as a wandering teacher in Athens. He did not write any texts. He was executed by drinking hemlock. Plato, on the other hand, belonged to the 427 to 347 BCE. He was a student of Socrates and he wrote dialogues and did establish the academy. The method that Socrates used is called the art of questioning to expose contradictions and provoke deeper thought. For Plato, he used dialogues where Socrates is often the main character or the protagonist, but represents Plato's developing philosophy. Now, from the philosophical aspect, we see that Socrates focused mostly on ethics, virtue, and how to live well, he left no systematic theory. For Plato, he developed a systematic philosophy, starting with the theory of forms, to political philosophy as is found in the Republic, to metaphysics and epistemology. About the legacy, we see that Socrates is remembered for his life, method, and moral integrity. Plato, on the other hand, is remembered for his vast written works and lasting schools of thought. So, if we are then to summarize or to sum up Socrates in a line or two, we would say that Socrates is a living teacher who focused on questioning and ethics. He wrote nothing. Plato, on the other hand, is a brilliant student who wrote the dialogues, built a philosophical system, and preserved Socrates' legacy. Now, Plato's theory of form, it says that the many changing, imperfect, sensible things we see, for example, the particular chairs, beautiful faces, acts of justice, are copies or participations of perfect, eternal, unchanging forms or ideas that exist beyond the sensible world. Real knowledge is knowledge of these forms. Mere opinion or belief is about sensible things. Now, about epistemology, which is the distinction between knowledge versus opinion, we see that for knowledge or episteme, it is said that it is a true justified grasp of forms. Opinion is doxa that concerns the sensible world and is fallible. Plato illustrates this distinction using the divided line in his work The Republic in book 6 and the allegory of the cave in Republic in his book 7. The divided line, the simple diagram, we know that the lowest in the divided line is the imagination or images or shadows. Next is the belief or sensible objects, and the higher is the discursive thought or mathematical reasoning. The highest is the understanding or intellect, the direct grasp of forms, especially the form of the good. And the other one, the allegory of the cave, we see that for Plato, the prisoners were the inborn children who have been born to darkness. All that they have seen throughout their life are only shadows. And the picture is such that their hands are tied behind their back, and there is a perennial fire which is being lit at the threshold of the cave. Now, the irony is none of them have seen the world beyond the threshold, for their face is always directed towards the wall of the cave. So all that the prisoners have ever seen since their birth were the shadows that were depicted or displayed on the walls. And those shadows were the shadows of the real objects outside the cave. That world, Plato says, is the sensible world or the world of senses. Now, amongst here, one of them frees and escapes. That is the making up of a philosopher. The philosopher escapes to see real objects, and initially his optic glands are not accustomed to the stark brightness, and so he adjusts his optic lenses to the comfort zone of shadows that he had been seeing throughout. Secondly, after having seen the shadows, he sees the real objects from which the shadows are cast. Now, having seen the real objects, say the shadow and the tree that the shadow was being cast, he sees the source from which there is all of this brilliant light. And that source is the sun. And then when he sees the sun, he realizes that this is the real world. The world that he and his imprisoned friends who had been in that cave for ever and always is a world of doxa. And then he returns. He returns to help others, to enlighten others. However, his friends who are still stuck in darkness takes his vision with a pinch of salt, thus showing that the philosopher's duty is to come back to the world of doxa, and still guide the people to the world of episteme, and that is why knowledge matters. Irrespective of how will one be received, how will one be jibed at, how will one be laughed at, but knowledge prevails over mere opinions. The other significant philosophical part of Plato has been the form of the good. Plato treats one form as supreme, the form of the good. It is the source of intelligibility, what makes forms knowable, and of value, what makes other things good. In the Republic, the good is compared to the sun. The sun makes visible objects visible. The good makes objects of knowledgeable, knowable, and gives them their beingness. Knowledge of the good enables right rule, hence, for Plato, if anyone who is to rule just, he has to be a king who has philosophical knowledge, and thus he upheld the significance of a philosopher king. Now, certain examples to make it concrete. For example, a particular bed is a bed because it participates in the form of bedness. Each drawn triangle is an imperfect instance. The form of triangularity is the perfect triangle that defines what triangle means. Similarly, beauty. Beauty can be defined as beautiful faces, poems, sunsets, which are beautiful insofar as they partake in the form of beauty. The form itself is not a beautiful face, but beauty itself, the standard. Now let's talk about the methodological and the pedagogical consequences. Dialectic, as we understand, is the rational questioning and elimination of contradictions, which is the method of ascending from opinion to knowledge of forms. Education aims to turn the soul from the world of sense to the world of forms. The Republic's educational program culminates in dialectic. Now, when we talk about certain objections or problems, we see that Plato's theory provoked several famous puzzles. Plato himself records some of them. Example, in the Parmenides, these key problems include the third man argument, which is if a form explains resemblance among particulars, then we must posit a further form to explain the resemblance between the form and particulars, leading to an infinite regress. Parmenides raises this as a dialectical difficulty. The participation is how exactly do particulars participate. Plato is suggestive rather than precise. Critics ask for a mechanism. Problems and famous objections, multiplicity of forms. Do we need a form for every predicate? What about form of white, form of red, form of large? This seems to multiply entities absurdly. If forms are wholly separate and transcendent, how can they explain change or causation in the sensible world? Aristotle and later critics preferred immanent forms, forms as aspects of particular things instead of transcendent ones. Now, the legacy and influence, we see that the forms shaped later Platonic, Neoplatonic and Christian metaphysics, example the divine ideas. In modern philosophy and mathematics, Platonism often means belief in abstract mind-independent entities, example numbers, mathematical objects. Plato's insistence that reason accesses deeper reality continues to influence epistemology, metaphysics and ethics. Now, if we are to check the strength, we see that the forms elegantly address how we can speak of sameness across change and ground objective knowledge and value. Weakness, on the other hand, the theory raises hard technical issues like participation, regress, relation to causation that led Aristotle and others to alternative accounts. Now, At this juncture, it is important to note why was Plato called a utopian. For this, let us come to his ideal state in the Republic. His dialogue in the Republic, Plato describes a perfectly just and harmonious society. This society is divided into three classes. Rulers, who are philosopher kings, they are wise, rational leaders who knows the form of the good and rules selflessly. Auxiliaries or warriors, courageous defenders who enforce laws and protects the state. Producers are farmers, artisans, merchants. They provide material needs but do not participate in ruling. Justice for Plato means that each class performs its proper function without interfering in the roles of others. Now, the question is this philosopher king an unreal ideal? Plato argued only philosophers, those who grasp the eternal forms and especially the form of the good, are fit to rule. In reality, political leaders are often motivated by ambition, wealth, or power. The idea of rulers being selfless, lovers of wisdom, seems highly unrealistic. This is why critics call his state utopian, which is too idealistic for actual politics. Now, what is it to do with the communism of families and property for guardians as seen in Plato's Republic? Let us go in detail. Plato suggests that the ruling and the warrior classes should not have private property or even traditional families. Children would be raised collectively and marriages arranged for eugenic purposes. This was meant to prevent corruption and personal interest from interfering with justice. To many, this sounds impractical, even radical, another reason for the utopian label. Now let us see how is this connected with abstract perfection versus real politics. Plato's vision of the state is built on the theory of forms, aiming for the perfect form of justice. But actual political life is messy. It is full of compromise, power struggles, and conflicting interests. His critics, notably Aristotle, said he was chasing an ideal blueprint that could never be fully realized. So why utopian? Because Plato envisioned a perfectly just state guided by philosopher kings with communal life and strict class divisions. It was too idealistic and detached from practical politics. Later thinkers like Sir Thomas More, who coined the word utopia in 1516, saw in Plato's Republic one of the earliest examples of utopian thinking, constructing an imaginary perfect society as a critique of real ones. Plato is thus called a utopian because his vision of the Republic describes an ideal society based on perfect justice, philosopher kings, and communal living, a model too perfect to exist in practice. So, how do we describe Plato's philosophy then? Plato's philosophy can be described as, number one, metaphysical idealism. He posited a two-level reality. The sensible world, which is changing, is imperfect, and the world of forms, which is eternal, perfect, intelligible. Epistemology of reason, true knowledge, which is episteme, comes not from the senses, but from rational understanding of forms. Ethics and justice, virtue is harmony of the soul's parts, which is reason, spirit, appetite. Justice is everyone doing their proper role. Now about political philosophy. We see that in the Republic, the ideal state is ruled by philosopher kings who know the form of the good. Educational philosophy is this where, though the allegories of the cave, divided line, and sun, Plato shows how education lifts the soul from ignorance to illumination. The dialectic is where philosophy is a process of questioning and reasoning to ascend towards truth. In short, Plato is the philosopher of eternal truth, rational knowledge, and ideal justice, grounding politics and ethics in a metaphysical vision. Now, point number 2 is modern philosophers who have worked on Plato extensively are some of the brightest names, and we should make a mention of some of them. Plato has been read and reinterpreted through every era. A few modern, say 19th to 21st century thinkers stand out. For example, Friedrich Nietzsche. He criticized Plato's dualism and other worldly forms as life-denying, calling him the great corrupter who prepared ground for Christianity's emphasis on transcendence. A.N. Whitehead famously said that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Martin Heidegger, who saw Plato's philosophy as decisive in shaping Western metaphysics, especially the privileging of being as idea. Karl Popper, in The Open Society and Its Enemies, he criticized Plato's Republic as authoritarian and utopian. Iris Murdoch, a Platonist in moral philosophy, argued that the good functions as a transcendent moral reality guiding human life. Martha Nussbaum, who engaged deeply with Plato in ethics, particularly in the Symposium and Republic, linking his insights to contemporary issues. Julia Annas and Myles Burnett, they are the modern Platonic scholars who focus on Plato's epistemology, ethics, and education. Now, if we are to talk about Plato's simile of the sun, we have to go to the Republic, Book 6, where Plato compares the form of the good to the sun. Just as the sun gives light, that is, making sight possible, and life, making growth possible, the good gives truth, making knowledge possible, and being or value, making existence meaningful. The good is beyond being, which is called as epikenia tes ousias, which is supreme, the source of all intelligibility and order. Now, I think we should also be interested in checking out how Plato's simile of the sun, Plato's allegory of the cave, and Plato's divided line, which had influenced authors from worldwide, as had been mentioned, Nietzsche, Whitehead, Heidegger, Karl Popper, Murdoch, Nussbaum, and many others. It would be really interesting to check out how has that been mapped, or if that could be mapped in the Oriental tradition. In our next lecture, we will be talking about the Eastern mapping of Plato's philosophy vis-a-vis Vishnu's Maharupa, or the Vishwarupa of the Bhagavad Gita, and that again would be a thought experiment. Thank you so much.